James Croft is the Research and Education Fellow at the Humanist community at Harvard. He's a candidate for an education doctor in human development and education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He grew up on Star Trek, Sagan, and Shakespeare, and is a proud gay humanist. Welcome, James Croft.
Before I begin, I want to give you one moment to sit together and appreciate my jacket. I just thought I would give you an opportunity to see this extraordinary piece of British design. Apparently, it's also perfectly in the Ohio State colors, I was just informed. That was not purposeful, but it's a happy accident. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. This is my favorite jacket. Now we can get down to the real business. On March the 9th, 1965, Martin Luther King led the second march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. Part of the voting rights movement in Selma, the Selma to Montgomery marches were one of the turning points in the civil rights movement in America. The second march came at an intensely emotional moment, directly after Bloody Sunday, on which marchers had been ruthlessly beaten by state and local police and attacked with tear gas. King wanted the second march to have as much emotional resonance and political clout as he could possibly give it. And so he explicitly made a call for clergy, religious leaders from across the country to join him. Hundreds of clergy from different faith traditions descended on Selma to join the march and gathered at Brown's Chapel. King decided to march that day despite a court order against it, telling the hundreds of clergy gathered there, "I would rather die on the highways of Alabama than make a butchery of my conscience." King led the group of marchers to the far side of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and then stopped and asked them to kneel and pray. After prayers, they rose and retreated back across the bridge to Brown's Chapel, avoiding a violent confrontation. 2 weeks later, after the final successful march to Montgomery, and after the brutal beating to death of James Reeb, a Unitarian Universalist minister from Boston, King said these words: "There never was a moment in American history more honorable and more inspiring than the pilgrimage of clergymen and laymen of every race and faith pouring into Selma to face danger." That march, that second march from Selma to Montgomery, was an interfaith march. It was born of an explicit call to clergy. It started and ended in a church. And the turning point, the climax of the whole action, was a prayer. People down on their knees on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, praying together to end racial injustice in America. And while I talk about atheist participation in interfaith work, I want you to have that image in your mind, because I want you to ask yourselves a question today. Would you, if you had the time and resources and the opportunity, have followed King's call and marched with him on Montgomery? Because many humanists did. As recorded in the book The Humanist Way by Edward Erickson, there were many, many non-religious and atheist people there. They swallowed whatever concerns they had about the word clergy, about praying, about hosting the action in a church, about being considered a member of a religion, and they followed King on that march, which was a major part of civil rights history. Now, I have no doubt that in following King to Selma that day and engaging in the prayer session which he led, some amount of religious privilege was reinforced, and faith took some of the credit for the action, as I would argue it rightly should. Atheists allowed themselves to be described and thought of as part of a faith. And at the same time, a blow was struck for civil rights which reverberated around the country. Now, I have a simple proposition for you today, and that proposition is that sometimes to participate in interfaith activities is the right thing to do, even if you're an atheist. Not always, not on every occasion, not all forms of interfaith activity, but often getting involved in interfaith work is entirely consistent with our highest values as secular people. And that is simply the argument that I want to leave you with today. But first, what do I mean by interfaith work? What actually is it? Well, I want to give you a sense of the average interfaith gathering. Can you just kind of join hands with the person next to you? You know, just take your hands, right? And just feel in communion with them. And then, perhaps gaze deeply into their eyes. And then, if you'll sing along with me, Kumbaya, my Lord, Kumbaya. Kumbaya, my Lord, Kumbaya. And sway a bit. Perhaps caress each other's faces. Look deep into your eyes and say with me, I respect your beautiful religious tradition. I respect it, even though it's different to mine. Right? That is what interfaith looks like. You get around a campfire, and someone gets out a guitar, or even better, a ukulele, and you sing with each other, right? That's basically what it is. And you say nice things about religion and faith. That is how interfaith is often stereotyped in the atheist movement. And I have never been to an interfaith event which is remotely like that. I kind of think like I might actually enjoy that, but I understand that I'm in a minority in the room in that, but that's not what I mean when I'm talking about interfaith work. What I'm talking about is when people of different faiths and none are explicitly brought together to work on some common cause. That's what I think interfaith is. So the task can be, and often is, dialogue, discussion, but it also includes service work and political activism, like the example that I started with. And the purpose of these activities is not evangelism and not primarily religious criticism, although that often happens, and I'll talk about that a little later. The purpose is to help people understand each other better and to come to respect other people, other human beings, even if you don't respect their ideas. To understand that the Mormon and the Muslim and the evangelical Christian are a human being just like you, and often with many shared values in common. That's the purpose of these sorts of activities. Now, why might we want to engage in them? Why might we want to put our big red A in the middle of all these nice little religious symbols? Well, I think that there are many reasons why we might want to do this, and some of them are just basic and obvious. Firstly, interfaith work is still, if it's good work, good work. Interfaith service work that's good service work is worth doing. And if atheists get involved, then more service work gets done. You feed more hungry people. You give out more sustainable light bulbs. Those are sorts of activities that we've done at Harvard. And if that work is worth doing, then being involved in it ourselves makes it more good work being done. And I think that's a basic reason to do it. Secondly, working alongside people of faith breaks down barriers and destroys stereotypes across the board. Yes, it helps us come to understand that our conceptions about religious people are not always correct. And that's very beneficial. As rationalists and skeptics, we should always be looking to reform our ideas when they're wrong. And this gives you some data on which to base your judgments about religious people. But it also breaks down stereotypes of atheists. Because it's a lot harder to have a negative stereotype about someone when you've just painted a house together, or given out reproductive, like condoms and stuff on the beach, or whatever it is you want to do. I'm not sure I've ever done that in an interfaith context, but I'm going to try and do that now. It has to be on a beach. I'm not sure why that idea came to me, but now I like it, and I'm going to make that happen. Beach condoms for all. So there is inherent value in working with other people who disagree with you towards a common goal, because you come to understand each other better. And I want to work towards a world where people understand each other better, even when they disagree. And finally, we need them. Like, we actually need religious people to achieve a lot of the social goals that we've been talking about today, to achieve those bigger goals of the secular movement that August talked about in the beginning of this wonderful conference. Things like improvements in the areas of gay rights and trans rights and women's reproductive rights, things like that. We're going to need a lot of religious allies. Our movement is tiny and getting bigger, but for a long time it's going to be tiny in comparison to religious movements in this country. And so we need allies. And engaging in interfaith work with other people is a great way to build allies. So those are, I think, the basic reasons why we might want to get engaged in this sort of work. But I do recognize and understand that many people are nervous about it. I recognize that there's a lot of reticence and reluctance around getting involved in interfaith work in the atheist community. And I'm sympathetic to that. I hear a lot of criticisms about the terminology, and I'll talk about it in a moment, about the whole idea of being seen as a faith group or just another religion. And I recognize those concerns. I think those concerns are real. And that's why I think to do good interfaith work as an atheist group, you need to proceed on the basis of 3 principles, or as I call them, the 3 commandments of atheist work. And they are these, atheist interfaith work. Firstly, values first. Secondly, negotiate equal representation. And thirdly, maintain your right to critique. Now, what do I mean by this? Yes, you can applaud me. Hell yeah. I think I'm supposed to say something like, preach, brother, or something at this point. It doesn't work with an English accent. I should. So values first. What does that mean? Well, we have values. We've come here together not really just because we're atheists, but because we have positive values we want to share with the world. And this is a simple one. Never engage in any interfaith effort that goes against your basic values. Like, don't join an interfaith coalition against equal marriage rights. That would be stupid. I don't see any of you doing it. But just keep in mind that it's possible that some interfaith coalitions are not ones that you actually want to join. Those ones you should be opposing and criticizing from the outside. So put your values first and just don't join the ones which don't represent your values. That one's easy. This one's a little more difficult. When you're going to the interfaith table, negotiate equal representation. Make sure that whatever representation religious groups have, you also have as a non-religious group. And that means, I think, 2 things primarily. Firstly, equal representation when it comes to giving voice to your worldview. This is a picture of me. Looking very dashing, I have to say. And I'm speaking at a forum on tolerance in Lynn, Massachusetts. And the idea of this concept of giving voice is, if there is an opportunity for religious people to express their worldview at some point in the event, you need an opportunity to express yours as well. If people are involving in some sort of panel discussion or there are a set of speakers, you need equal representation on that panel. If everyone in the religious groups are allowed to wear t-shirts identifying which religious group they come from, then you have to be able to wear your own t-shirts as well. However they represent the different groups involved, which will depend on the action that you're doing, you need to have equal representation there. And don't settle for less. Like, don't be the token atheist at the table who is not allowed to say anything or voice their point of view because it makes people uncomfortable. If you're going to go, you need to be an equal partner. And secondly, when it comes to equal representation, negotiate inclusive language. Now, I understand this is a sticking point for many people. They just don't want to do anything that's called interfaith. That's one of the reasons I started with a provocative example, an example which I hope makes many people question as to whether there might be higher values than our concerns about words. Because I really do think that if we're more worried about getting involved with something that's called interfaith than doing positive good in the world, we have our values around the wrong way. Our priorities are wrong. That's not to say, you can applaud that too. That's not to say, the 1 or 2 people who wish to applaud that may applaud that. That's not to say that the language issue is not a real issue. It's just not the only issue. But once you get yourself involved, negotiate for more inclusive language. If they're willing to change the term interfaith, get them to change it. Don't have them speaking, this is one really pisses me off. Like, everyone imagine the God of your understanding. I don't even know what that means if I was religious, right? I don't want to hear about the God of your understanding. I don't really like even people of faith and no faith. I think it's a bit clunky. Just make sure that you work with the organization to try and change their language. And a lot of the national major interfaith organizations are already doing that. They're being very welcoming of atheists and other non-believers, and they're trying to change their language. But that's a process, and I suggest you get involved in that process to try and help it out. And finally, maintain your right to critique. Yes, you have to have the right to give a his step. This is the most incorrect idea about interfaith work that people have in the atheist movement, which is that when you go into an interfaith space, you effectively muzzle yourself from giving any criticism of religion. It is not true. In interfaith spaces, people are well-organized ones. People are expected to keep their full identity. The whole point is to bring your whole identity to the table. So you will find evangelical Christians telling Muslims they are wrong, and that they should, in their view, believe in Jesus Christ. And you will find Jewish people telling Hindus that they are wrong. There is no barrier against critique within the interfaith space. But sometimes people get more uncomfortable if you bring a critique of the whole enterprise into it. Don't let them push that voice out. In fact, airing that voice in the interfaith space is one of the most important things you can do. Because, and this is just to recap this little points, values first, equal representation, right to critique. The best thing, I think, about atheist involvement in interfaith spaces is that if you do it well, if you do it proudly, if you refuse to put your critique aside and gain equal representation and give voice to your values, you actually shatter religious privilege. You introduce a completely different narrative into what otherwise would be an entirely religious space, and you make people ask really difficult questions. Like, well, I thought that atheists didn't help people, but here one is. That can be a real challenge. But if you weren't there, you're not introducing the cognitive dissonance. I thought atheists didn't have any values, but goodness, that sounded very valueful, that statement that I heard. That sounded practically pregnant with values, brimming and turgid with them. I better stop that before I get a bit carried away. And I want to end, because I want to have some time for questions, with an example from my own experience, which highlights what can happen if you are an unapologetic, open atheist in an interfaith space. And this is my favorite example. When I was speaking at that event where you saw the photo of me before, there was a panel on different religious perspectives on a whole day about, basically, it was called Many Faiths, One Family. It was about how we can get along even though we disagree with each other on matters of faith. And obviously, I went there as a member of not a faith. I don't have any faiths. So immediately the title of the thing is exclusionary to me in a certain way. And I even got a delightful little gift, which was a Barnes & Noble book voucher in a little envelope that said, James Croft, spiritual leader, which I kind of loved. I had a photo of that. I've still got that envelope. I think I might frame it. So it was a seriously religious space, and we started with chanting and the whole deal. And there was prayers and stuff. But I went anyway because I've had many experiences where the atheist presence genuinely disrupts things in a positive way. And the example that I like to give is this guy was giving the keynote speech. He's called Rabbi Waldox. And he was giving a whole speech about the importance of dialogue. And he had seen me on the panel earlier. And in the middle of his keynote presentation, he has this bit about how we have to reach out our hands and touch other people. You know, because rabbis and priests, they're like that. And so you reach out your hands and touch other people, you said. And this is what he said during his talk. He says, God has given you two hands. And then he stops. And he looks right at me, sitting in the audience, being like, and continues, or however you got them. But by evolution, however. But you've got them. You've got two hands. Now, I am willing to bet that he's done that talk before, and I'm willing to bet that he has never acknowledged before that there might be people who don't believe in God in the audience, and never given a name check to that little theory we like to call evolution, which so many people in America still seem to have a problem with, right? Now, to me, that is a win. To me, that moment is worth sitting through the chanting and the prayers and the hand-holding. I like the chanting. Okay, I'll admit, I like the chanting. I can chant the Hare Krishna like a pro. You ask me afterwards, I can do it. That is worth all the discomfort because it shatters the narrative that says only religious people have an investment in the biggest questions of human life. And every time I do an event like that, I get tons of people coming up to me and saying, thank you so much. I've been coming to this thing for years, and no one's ever said what I believe. Our people are out there. They're going to interfaith events, and they never hear anyone saying our side of the story. I think that that is reason enough to gussy up, to get over our concerns about some of the language, and get on down there and get engaged. But what I'd really like to do is hear your thoughts, so let me know what you think.
Between interfaith dialogue stuff and interfaith work, and I guess I've never had a problem with the language of using interfaith. We're not a faith, whatnot. My holdup has always been I don't like reinforcing the idea that doing something because your faith says that you should do it is actually a good thing. Because there's been an instance that I can think of where we were a group that I was involved with did a Christmas gift type thing, and then literally 2 months with a local church. 2 months later, that group was basically doing anti-LGBT stuff, and I felt like I was reinforcing the idea that it's a good thing to do something because your faith, I guess, demands that you do it. And so your story at the beginning about King. It makes me think like there's a dynamic relationship between like, you know, how bad is it that I'm reinforcing this idea and how good is the work that is being done. And I don't know how to like make that distinct, like figure out where that gray line is.
Right, I think a couple of things in response to that. I recognize the concern, it comes up a lot. Firstly, I think when I say values first, that also means choose your partners very wisely. I would never engage in any sort of interfaith service work with an organization that might conceivably, down the line, do something against my values. I just would never do it. I would never participate as an atheist group alongside an organization which might be anti-gay down the line. And there's plenty of liberal religious groups that are not. I mean, you can't always tell, but you have to be very careful. I think the second thing I'd say is, I'm not sure how the mechanism works. That our participation in the Interfaith Service Project reinforces the idea for them that faith is okay, if you make sure you have an opportunity to say what you really believe. As long as you have an opportunity at some point to say, I really think we shouldn't do this because of faith, and here's my reasons, I don't really see how the mechanism works that you're reinforcing that idea. I've never really understood what is the causal process that's being hypothesized by which your participation in this one event reinforces the idea that faith is in general a good thing. If someone can explain to me the process, I would love to know, but I don't know it right now. Like, I feel like this may be a concern that doesn't really play out. I'm going to go over here.
Me?
Yes, you.
Okay, so UW Medicine, we have a lot of really big religious groups, and our group, as an atheist group, is actually really big now too. And for a long time, we've been trying to make better connections with the other religious groups. We can do debates without it being so contentious, more just like working together. Do you have any advice for starting like an interfaith council on campus?
You know, I'm not really the right person. I should have said at the beginning of this talk. I've done some interfaith stuff, but it's not my main area of activity. I basically see myself as an evangelical humanist. I want to convert people. So I get really annoyed in interfaith spaces because I'm really like, sometimes. But, you know, it's worth doing still. But the question about how do you get involved in it and start a group yourself, I mean, find other people who are interested in it to begin with. And what difficulty have you had? Have you tried something already?
Well, we've like emailed them and we're like, oh, we should do events, and it just sort of like drops off, or they stop responding to us, and we don't want to be annoying either, but we do want to get something started.
You have to be willing to be annoying to get something started. Listen, you have to take this away from everything you take away from this. You have to be willing to be persistent enough to annoy people, because otherwise nothing ever happens. I think that there are often a small group of people who are very invested in this idea, and it's finding that small group of people, and then you have your first event and it becomes big. And you know, I'm not totally against, I'm not even totally against, I freaking love debates and stuff like that. There are different forms of interfaith dialogue. Some of them are very much more kumbaya-ish on the level of the scale. But there are other organizations which really promote contestation, like respectful disagreement and opposition. And they call each other opponents. You know, it's kind of like a duel, you know. But you do it kind of respectfully. You respectfully skewer them through the gun. With reason sword. Reason blaze. That would be. Oh, I'm using that in a D&D campaign. So I think find a small group of people who are really invested in it and just be persistent. I'm not sure that's a very helpful answer, but you can ask afterwards. I can also put you in touch with the guru of all this stuff, so he will tell you how to do it. So yes, let's go here.
Can you recommend inclusive language for interfaith or sources?
I got no ideas. Like, I mean, people keep coming up with these ideas about interworld view. I mean, you know, raised on Shakespeare, Sagan, and Star Trek, my Shakespeare gene, whatever it is, just hates, it doesn't scan. Interworld view just doesn't scan. It's gross. But it's okay. I mean, whatever people will accept. I don't think we should get hung up on finding the perfect word. Whatever your local group will accept as acceptable for you, push that. I think that a lot of different ones are going to come up with different ways of doing this. I have a friend who's always pushing the idea of interpath. Nah. I'm sorry, he's going to see this. I love you, I love you. It's not about you. It's me. Okay, if Aaron Rao wants to ask a question, I should probably take it. Oh, and now he's standing up, sure.
More of a comment, actually.
Oh.
While I understand, why you would say interfaith, just for the reasons that it works in the conversation that you're trying to get at, if you want to still distinguish yourself from a faith group, because some of us who fight creationists are very sensitive to the way they try to push their own faults onto us and project faith onto us, right? Well, the shirt I'm wearing is both the symbol and the name for the subset of atheists to which I belong and identify, epistemists, those who reject faith. So just advertise yourself this way while you participate in that group.
Right, and I have never used the word epistemist, but I love it. But I have certainly been very vocal about the fact that I reject faith as a means of making decisions. I once was on a week-long intensive Harvard Interfaith Learning and Dialogue program, and really everyone hated me by the end. I'm not going to be too... Well, no, so I had some allies, but every opportunity I was like, they had all these case studies about how people had prayed and come up with good decisions. And I was like, well, where are the people, all the millions of people who pray and come up with sucky decisions? Like, that is a terrible way to teach it. And I said it again, and again, and again. And the thing is, if I hadn't have been there would be no one to say that stuff. And so that's why I think it's really important to get involved, even though I have to sit through tons of these douchey case studies. CEOs who are like, I prayed and I turned my company around. I'm like, are you serious? Jesus, well, George Bush prayed and he took us into 2 wars. And I actually said that to them. And yeah, they were pissed off, but I was like, well, screw you, basically. I have just the right to be here as you do. But I said it in a British accent, so I can get away with it. I'm sorry, catch me afterwards. Thank you very much.